particularly on Europe. And as a matter of fact, the title is Challenges of the Mediterranean Crisis. Now, whether or not you want to use the word crisis, of course, is up to you. Certainly, I think for some groups in Europe, it certainly looks like a crisis. And as we've heard already, this is really an enormous challenge for Europe, a new challenge, and there are lots of multi-level aspects to this, some at the international level, some at the regional level, and some within the countries themselves, both the countries where the migrants are leaving from and those that receive them, and in between the countries where they move through. And certainly myself, as a fellow with the Institute of Third World Affairs that has worked extensively in Libya, we've seen the kind of debilitating effects that these migrant flows can have on the ability of local criminal elements to really use these flows and with the money then really sustain themselves against the local government. So there are very important local dimensions to this as well. We have a terrific set of panelists gathered for you today. I'll introduce them and tell you what each will talk about very briefly, and in the order that we'll go. We've structured it a little bit. First of all, we're going to have Andrew Taylor. And Andrew, like myself, was a fellow of the Institute of Third World Affairs in Syria and has since become truly one of the global experts on that country. And Andrew will talk about some of the internal crises that have within Syria, what provoked this kind of outflow and possibly some solutions. And then we're going to go to Kate Phillips-Barrasso, who's the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the International Rescue Committee. Kate will talk about some of the hosting countries and also some of the issues related to asylum. And then we're going to go kind of to the international level almost, and Shelley Peterman, who's the UNHCR regional representative for US and Caribbean, will talk about Europe, but also about some of the recommendations that UNHCR would like to make as possible solutions to some of these issues. And then finally, Simon Henshaw, who's Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration at the U.S. Department of State, will then talk about U.S. policy toward the issue. So a terrific set of panelists, I think. We have a little more time, so I'll give our panelists about 5 to 7 minutes each to make their statement, and then we'll move on to questions and answers, and have a couple of other people before the question and answer session that make a comment as well. So with that, Andrew, please.
Thank you very much, Dirk. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Great. First of all, it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all today. Not only is it great to speak in front of a packed room, but I know from looking at the guest lists and those attending that all of you care very much about what's going on. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm American. I'm not Syrian, and so and I think that's an important point. My basic job, based on my experience in the country, is to try and come up with some rational alternatives and policy alternatives concerning the Syrian crisis. I don't claim to be an expert on the suffering of the Syrian people, although I think I this morning have a tremendous amount to say about it, and it's particularly relevant to the discussion we have here. I was also glad to see from the guest list that we have also migrants like Ola Rafai, my former colleague at the Washington Institute, and a lot of others here from the refugee community who really care about these issues, and I would suggest that you speak with them as part of these proceedings. So, in terms of the migration crisis itself, and here I'm speaking in broad brushstrokes, so I think they match up with generally what you'll find out there. The reason why Syria is relevant to this conversation is between 40 and 50% of those that are showing up in Europe right now are coming from Syria in one way, shape, or form. And it's really hard to say. Recently, there's been a lot of discussion about these refugees, but the reason why this is happening now is not just because of Syria, but it has been magnified because of the Syrian conflict and our inability to deal with it as in terms of the international community. And I think we'll get into a little bit of a discussion. Already there was a discussion about it. The basics of the crisis are pretty simple. You have a minority-based government in Damascus, led by Bashar al-Assad, who is an Alawite, who has tried to blast, shoot, Scud missile and gas his way out of an uprising and controls roughly about a quarter of the country at the moment. He has been bolstered by every international break, an Iranian support intervention by the IRGC, and most recently by Russia. On the other side, you have the opposition, which represents, which largely hails from the Sunni Arab majority in the country, around 61% of the country, approximately, depending on how you cut it. And then, of course, we have the third player in terms of the Kurds. Syria's, I'm not going to go into how the uprising started. You all follow these issues very closely. But what has happened over time is that as the Assad regime has unsuccessfully tried to blast its way out of the uprising, the opposition has also fragmented into a number of different groups based on ethnicity, sometimes on religion, sometimes on ideology, that are all in one way or shape or form fighting each other. And this has displaced, this overall fight has displaced roughly half of Syria's population and has either internally displaced refugees in neighboring countries or now migrants going to Europe. It's important to note that a majority of those who are showing up in Europe and elsewhere are being pushed out of the country by Assad regime attacks. Of course, this is juxtaposed with most recent developments in eastern Syria concerning ISIS and the atrocities there. But it's important to note that. Whether that will stay the dominant theme as it unfolds, I'm not sure. There are plenty of people who are fleeing ISIS atrocities as well, but most of them are from the war crimes being carried out by the Assad regime, whether it concerns siege and starve tactics throughout the country, or the bombardment of civilian populations. So it's important to note this. It's also important to note, I think, that, and this is emphasized most recently by, I work at the Washington Institute. I have two colleagues, Fabrice Balanche and Aaron Zellen, who have done a lot of really interesting work on the Syria crisis and the things that have evolved from it. And they have specifically looked at how this has, over time, evolved into a sectarian-based war in which each side carries out ethnic cleansing. Now, the Assad regime is responsible for most of the displacements inside the country, but what we're looking at in the case of Syria right now is we're in a very difficult situation. The country that I lived in for so long, it exists in terms of a concept. It does not exist on a map in terms of reality of battle lines at the moment. Whether that will ultimately be the case or not, I'm not sure. But when you have a country that breaks into multiple parts, it's a real challenge for the international community about how to respond. So thus far, the Syria conflict has generated two major byproducts. I'm not saying they're the only byproducts, I'm just saying two major byproducts: displaced persons and extremists and U.S. designated terrorist groups on all sides of the Syrian conflict. So if you look at the Syrian conflict, of course, most famous terrorist group or the extremist group would be ISIS, but we also have Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda affiliate. We also have the PKK, or their variant in northeastern Syria, and then of course with the Assad regime we have the IRGC Quds Force in Lebanese Hezbollah. Now, the question is, what's the answer to all of this, right? And I think that's where this has become, it's often talked about in government circles as the most complicated issue that the United States has ever faced in terms of Middle East crises. I'm not so sure that that's fair to say in terms of the history of the United States. But I'm not exactly sure what the overall solution is. I think wars have a life of their own, and unfortunately this one has a very bad trajectory at the moment, and I think will probably continue for quite some time. But the two things, I think, that could be done to stem the flow of the displaced persons, which we're largely talking about, I think, here today, and to defeat ISIS, is an overall effort to focus on ISIS while also establishing buffer safe zones in Syria involving U.S. allies that border Syria. And I'm not alone in advocating this. There are a whole host of security and humanitarian reasons to set them up. The problem, of course, is, and this is a political issue, and will be a political issue, I think, in the upcoming campaign for the president, this would require substantial military involvement by the international community, including the United States. The second issue, I think, to deal with in terms of the overall crisis is replacing President Bashar al-Assad with a different leader, either from the regime in the short term or from outside of it in the long term. And currently there are a lot of diplomatic efforts underway to carry that out, and led by Secretary Kerry. We'll have to see where they go. It's good that people are talking. I can tell you though that there's remains substantial disagreement on what an end state in Syria would be, who would head that government, and gets down to some really basic logistical questions like how do you carry out an election in a country which is ruled by a leader who has been elected by upwards of 98% of the vote in the last 3 elections, right? So this is not, and for some of you that ever read my work with ICWA, the piece I did on the Syrian elections, I think can tell you all you need to know. I think if we don't press on these 2 points, I'm not sure we can really truly help Syrians solve this problem. And I think we really do need to help them solve it. And also, I don't think we're going to be able to find a process where Syrians can go back to their country and live in peace. One of the outcomes of this war might not just be national fragmentation, whether in the short term or the long term, but might be the long-term and permanent displacement of Syrians throughout the world. I think that's something that we deserve, we should, I think we have an obligation to help them be able to return to their homes in peace. Most recent in the news, in policy circles, there's an interim stopgap measure that I'd like to add as a sort of last corollary to this. Is being floated about what they call de-escalation and ceasefires, tied to the international talks recently started in Vienna with Secretary Kerry, which is now called the International Syria Support Group. I'm skeptical that this will be able to ultimately solve the Syria crisis. I think there's too much going on. De-escalation and ceasefires have not worked in Syria, but it might be that it could be that in some parts of the country this might work to help tamp down some of the violence and allow people to find some stability and perhaps be more rational as part of the diplomatic process to end the Syria crisis. So on that happy note, I'll end and hand it over to
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you very much for explaining some of the push factors behind this. Now on the other side, move on.
I think on behalf of the people who are in the back of the room, and I was for a while, if the people who are speaking could stand up, because then we could actually see the voices and watch their mouths go and know who's talking in the back of the room. And so on behalf of the back of the room, I'd like to say, please stand up.
Well, here's to you, Kate.
Is it okay if I stand over there?
Of course.
It just feels a little elevated to be standing on the stage towering over everybody.
And Kate will talk to us about hosting countries and some issues related to asylum. Kate, please.
Okay, great. Well, I hope everyone can see me. I can certainly see all you, so I think that means that I'm within range. I first have to apologize for the quality of my voice. I've been a little under the weather this week. I think I speak for probably a number of people in the room who've been working around the clock since the Paris attacks and pushing back against some of the negative political developments in this country around the resettlement of Syrian refugees. So I just wanted to say a quick word about the International Rescue Committee, the organization that I work for, and it's our perspective on the Syria crisis. We're really working in the full arc of what's transpiring here, meaning we're working inside Syrian non-government controlled areas to deliver assistance to the people that need it. We're working in the 4 surrounding refugee hosting countries in the region. And this summer, recognizing the increasing numbers and frankly, the lack of assistance towards people arriving in Europe, opened up operations on the island of Lesbos where half of the people arriving into Greece, which is obviously the largest recipient country of migrants and refugees arriving. And then finally, we have a storied history and actually started as a resettlement organization here in the US. We have 26 offices across this country where we resettle refugees, including in Silver Spring, Maryland, and we're resettling actively Syrian refugees right now. So you really are seeing this from sort of the origins to what we see as a durable solution of resettling people here in the U.S. who are facing so many protection and challenges that were just outlined by Andrew. So before I move to talk about the regional picture in a very short time span, I do want to highlight a couple of the recent humanitarian statistics from inside Syria because they really will blow your hair back. These come from the recent humanitarian needs overview. There are 13.5 million people inside Syria who are in need of humanitarian assistance. And 6.5 million of those people are internally displaced. So I'll talk more about the refugee situation. I think we're all familiar with those numbers. We surpassed the 4 million mark. When you think about the fact that there's 6.5 million people who are displaced within Syria's borders, it gives you an idea of how dire the situation is within the country. 4.4 million of those people are categorized as hard to reach or besieged, which means that it's almost impossible to get some of these people aid, either due to the circumstances of fighting on the ground or because they are actively being cut off from receiving aid. 70% of Syrians don't have access to clean water now. 3 out of 4 of them live in poverty, and I think most tellingly, average life expectancy in Syria has dropped by 20 years since the conflict began. So that paints a picture, obviously, of what the push factors are in Syria that, lead people to moving onward to Europe and certainly to the surrounding countries in the region. Stand on stage. Okay.
It's for the light. It's for the light.
Not away in the light. Okay. I feel like it's a dance recital. What's unfortunate about, getting feedback from the mic, what's unfortunate about what's going on, and Andrew touched on this in his remarks, is that we are now officially in a protracted refugee crisis. There's really no end in sight. I think UNHCR defines protracted crises as 5 years or more. And while we do see these flickers of hope around the Vienna process, I don't think that anyone harbors any illusions that anyone is going to be going home anytime soon, which is really telling in terms of what the response needs to be in the region to support a long-term displaced population. So again, to offer some additional statistics that are also staggering, Turkey is now the largest refugee hosting country in the world with 2.2 million refugees. Lebanon is now the largest per capita refugee hosting country in the world with 1 million refugees out of a population of only 4 million Lebanese nationals. So as much as I'm going to talk about some of the curtailing asylum space there, I do want to start my remarks by saying that is nothing short of heroic, some of the the openness that we have seen to date in light of the numbers of people heading towards these countries and what it means for their own systems, their own demographics, et cetera, to keep their doors open. And again, in light of some of the political developments in this country around the resettlement of Syrians, I'd like us to just pause and think about how we as a country would react if our population doubled, or actually increased by a quarter over the span of 2 or 3 years. So it is amazing that they have managed to keep this asylum space largely open to Syrians as they're forced to flee. But at the same time, we are seeing over the course of this crisis a significant uptick in the vulnerability of Syrians who have been displaced to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. And I'm going to touch on a few of the reasons why I think that's happening. The first is tightening legal restrictions on the asylum space, meaning it's just a lot harder and getting a lot harder by the year to actually be up to date with your papers and have all of the proper documentation to stay, not have to live in the shadows and be able to access basic services. We are actually seeing, second, a reduction in public services that, again, have been generously offered by some of these countries, but they just can't keep up, and so as a result have closed off some things like health services to Syrians who don't live in camps. Inability of Syrians to support themselves. A lot of Syrians who fled arrived with their own resources. Those are long since gone. And so we're seeing the vulnerability of people who no longer have those to draw on, but then also can't support themselves because if they are able to work, it's usually in illegal jobs and in the shadows and highly exploitative situations where they're not paid nearly as well as they should be. And then the fourth is the declining humanitarian aid. And on that, I would just note that, when I say declining humanitarian aid, it's not necessarily that donors are cutting their aid. There's been an incredible increase in global humanitarian giving, particularly motivated by this crisis. The thing is that it just cannot keep up with the magnitude of what's transpiring on the ground. And so as a result, there are incredibly hard choices being made about targeting towards most vulnerable people. And unfortunately, a lot of people, if not everybody in this crisis, is vulnerable in one shape or form. So just a few more notes on that because I know that we're a little bit pressed on time. I'm going to offer some statistics under each of a few of these categories. 70% of Syrians in Lebanon don't have a valid legal stay in the country. And you can imagine what that means when you're moving about, worried about deportation or detention, how the fear that instills in people and the situation that it forces them into when they're out and about in their daily lives. The same goes for Jordan. 85% of the total registered Syrian refugees who live outside of camps are facing significant trouble keeping up their paperwork. I mentioned before these reduced services as the second reason why we're kind of seeing a tightening space in the region. The Ministry of Health in Jordan last year actually had to close off free subsidized health services to non-camp-based refugees because they cited that they weren't able to afford it. So this has meant that refugees who are in incredibly economic vulnerable positions, some of whom are suffering from chronic conditions, cannot access these services without paying out of pocket or actually traveling back to their original site of registration to be able to use the documentation cards, which are sort of tied to the area where they register, to get those helpings in camp. So it's sort of this gauntlet of bureaucracy that people face if they're trying to access these services. And then I'll just note that it is really difficult, the right to work situation in the region. It's a very tricky topic, and it's one that's highly debated about, and I would add not necessarily just in the Syria region, is whether or not refugees should be able to work given some of the economic conditions facing those countries. But without the ability to actually work legally, people continue to work, but they just end up again in highly exploitative situations in the informal sector, agriculture, food service, etc., if they can, and oftentimes working 6 or 7 days a week for less than half of the wages that would normally go in the market where they've been displaced to. So I'm just going to close on a note, and recognizing we only have 5 to 7 minutes, of what does this actually mean for people, this constricting space because of reduced aid and because of a reduced legal space for them to live in the surrounding countries. It means first and foremost increased poverty. 2 out of 3 of Syrians living outside of camps in Jordan are living below the poverty line. It means, as I mentioned before, risky and exploitative work situations. People are paid less, they work longer, and they have fewer protections. They're living in fear of deportation in some cases if their paperwork is not up to snuff. And then I think probably most tellingly is negative coping mechanisms, which is this catch-all, very bland term for behavior that people have to resort to in order to make ends meet and to survive. In the Syria region, we see that a lot through particularly child labor. Increasingly, families are relying on children as their means of economic survival for a variety of reasons we don't have time to get into, but you see this when you're on the streets of Beirut or in any of these countries, a lot of children begging, a lot of children working in agriculture, out of schooling, and obviously that does not bode well for them now, but certainly their futures. And then finally, an uptick in early marriage. Again, another coping mechanism families are using to try to weather the fact that they really don't have the resources they need to survive. Finally, I think probably one of the biggest coping mechanisms that you're seeing, and that we'll talk about here today and the rest of the panel, is this onward movement to areas of secondary displacement. People recognizing that maybe they don't have a future, certainly not in Syria, perhaps not in the surrounding region, so hedging their bets and looking onward to go somewhere else because they don't see the circumstances improving. In fact, they're deteriorating pretty rapidly in the region.
Great, thank you so much, David. Gary, do you feel comfortable standing up?
I will stand up and try to repeat a couple of general points that were made earlier and that perhaps not everybody heard. There are now more refugees and displaced persons than any time since World War II. We're at the 60 million mark, with more than 4,200 people being forced to leave their homes every day. So this is a very important factor in terms of just the scale of the challenges that UNHCR, together with many, many partners, both UN, governmental and non-governmental, that we have to face with, as it was stated before, with respect to the 3RP, with our funding for Syria, with considerably fewer resources available, even though the general pot has increased. but the overall requirements are even larger than ever before. So, for example, the Syria 3RP is now funded at 50%, notwithstanding the most generous contributions from the United States as well as from the European Union. A number that hasn't been mentioned that I think is important to highlight today is that as of the end of June 2015, 84,000 refugees voluntarily repatriated to their homes. 84,000 is practically none. There are very few solutions being found now politically that allow refugees to safely return to their homes. Conflicts, as was mentioned, are protracted. In the last 5 years, we've seen 15 conflicts either start or reignite, for example, South Sudan, in Central African Republic, in Yemen, and so on. And all of this is happening without an end in sight, as we read every day in the newspaper. So we're at a critical juncture in terms of how the international community is going to address the fact that humanitarian assistance is simply not sufficient, as the High Commissioner has often stated, and it was also mentioned before that there's a real obligation now to look at the opportunities and the need to address the needs of refugees and migrants as well from the point of view of development from the very onset of an emergency. This is a challenge that we'll be carrying forward with international financial institutions and in different international fora in the course of 2016. Most states around the world actually do respect asylum very generously, and Kate spoke to the generous asylum policies, notwithstanding important challenges now facing refugees in terms of documentation and legal protection in Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey. The numbers are overwhelming, and the general policy has been remarkably generous over time. And the same can be said for many of the states in Africa and Asia and the United States, of course, as well. In Europe, we have had, up until very recently, an open border policy, and a very generous one, of access both directly through asylum, direct requests for asylum, as well as through resettlement. And we're seeing a change now in recent months, which I'll come to in a moment. The root causes of displacement are more complex. It's not just a civil war situations. There are many, many complex non-state actors. And we're also beginning to see the effects of climate change on how that impacts on migration and food insecurity and population growth and urbanization. And these are also issues that in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals and the World Humanitarian Forum coming up in 2016, coupled with the challenges of development that will need to be addressed. So the issue in its complexity hopefully will involve more actors and interested parties with a view to finding solutions and mobilizing more resources. As people are moving, the flight is also increasingly dangerous, and we're seeing that, regrettably, on the news. As Americans, we're witnessing practically daily stories of boats that are capsizing and people that are suffering the consequence of unsafe, disorderly, and illegal flight, as Doris Meisner was mentioning before. And this is what we've been appealing for in the context of Europe, but not just Europe. We had recently conferences in Southeast Asia with respect to the mass departures of stateless persons and refugees from Myanmar in particular, looking for ways for Southeast Asian states to organize themselves in order to address the challenges of important migrations in an orderly way. And UNHCR, among others, is also advocating for the same with respect to the movement of Central American refugees today, as the numbers reach unprecedented levels for this time of year, of unaccompanied children and others. We're looking for safe, orderly, and legal ways for people to move, and without those opportunities, refugees and migrants will definitely be subject to exploitation by smugglers and traffickers, and they will suffer the consequence. And they will take the lead in terms of managing the flow in a way that does not serve the national interest, regional interest, and most importantly, of course, the interests of the people who need international protection. 8 out of 10 refugees are still hosted in the developing world. So let's not forget that the burden of asylum is principally being borne, if it's a burden at all, borne by developing countries or middle-income countries that are not benefiting as much as they need to from international support. So you have Ethiopia, and Kenya, now Mali, and Tunisia, and many other countries, all developing. What happened in the middle of 2015 was that, as the High Commissioner said in a rather provocative way, the poor people, the poor refugees, the most vulnerable, finally knocked on the door of the richest union and community in the world. And the world woke up to that fact. The objective should not be to stem the flow. It is, as Ambassador Swing said at the very onset, an issue of managing what is a normal flow of migrants in a competitive environment, labor migrations and others, but also, in this context, a regrettably obliged flow, forced flow of people who are leaving Syria because of war. And that cannot be stemmed. They will not stop coming until there is a resolution to the conflict and until the conditions in asylum allow them to, for the reasons that Kate also elaborated on, allow them to be able to thrive and to take care of their children. After all, their family is just like you and I. And they're watching as not only they become more impoverished and they get less resource, less support from the international community, but as their children miss year after year after year, and now we're in the 4th year, after year of access to education and to growth. And so they will move and they will not be stemmed as a flow, rather it needs to be managed. And we've been calling for that from the get-go. The High Commissioner has been saying that there needs to be regional cooperation, there need to be legal and orderly ways for refugees in need of international protection to be identified, to be received, registered, and to be assisted until such time as they're allowed to go home, as has always been the approach of the international community. So again, to paraphrase Doris Meisner, where she said earlier, following up on comments by James Purcell, that there needs to be a whole-of-government approach. What UNHCR has been advocating for is a whole-of-Europe approach, that every country needs to play its part, and as one razor wire fence has been built after another razor wire fence, we see that becomes more and more difficult, and the burden borne, now I should stop talking about burden, because in the case of Germany, this will be, in years to come, it will be proven, a real opportunity for Germany, as well as hopefully for Sweden and Austria, who've been the most generous receiving countries in Europe so far. Not the only ones. UNHCR just published a survey, which you'll be able to find on our website, unhcr.org, where we interviewed a meaningful sample of refugees who had arrived just in the last few months in Greece. And there were a couple of rather surprising results. 86% of the people that we interviewed had a secondary or university education. 86%. The vast majority had the intention to go to Germany because that's where they could find jobs, that's where they could pursue their education. But they would stay in Greece if they could. They would seek asylum there if there were jobs and if there was access to education. They want the best for themselves and their families. But the more surprising result is that the majority were actually coming directly from Syria now. They're not coming as much as we. There is a number coming. There, a solid more than a third of them are coming from the first countries of asylum: Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. But the vast majority are coming directly from Syria, en passant through Turkey. And this is a reflection not only of the impoverishment and the lack of resources and support and the actual war that's hitting Syria, but it's also a reflection of the despair, the loss of hope. The fact that there is no way for these individuals, like I said, educators, barbers, professionals, housewives, we had all sorts of bakers. I mean, the whole community is on the move at this point, and it will reestablish itself in Europe, but early on, as soon as possible, I'm sure that they would want to go home if they could. Let me conclude with just a further remark that, and to underline that it's very important that there be safe and legal opportunities for refugees to seek asylum. There is no alternative to that, whether it's through, as we've spoken about earlier, a combination of in-country, other visa types of policies, labor migration, temporary protection, whatever it must be. There has to be a package of options that are available to people who need protection, whether it's from their home country of origin, whether it's from their first country of asylum through organized resettlement processes, whether it's in a quick way, as Canada has been doing it, or a slower way, as the U.S. promises to, whether it's as formal refugees or not. For example, 5,000 Syrian refugees going with labor visas to Brazil. All opportunities to solve this problem in the short term need to be identified and pursued. But the bottom line, of course, let there be no doubt, is that there needs to be a stop to the war so that the refugees can go home as soon as possible.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just mention that before I introduce our final panelist, Simon Henshaw, that Simon needs to leave at 11:30 sharp. And so what we'll do is we'll let him make his remarks, and then, because his remarks are going to be specifically on U.S. policy, and if there are questions that specifically geared toward that topic, we'll field them right after Simon is done, so that he can leave at 11:30, and then we'll come back to the remainder of the program. Simon, please.
Thank you very much. So if I'm smart, I'll talk for 16 minutes. So, response to the Mediterranean crisis. I'm going to talk about the U.S. response overall and give you some of our thinking there and some of my own thinking. Our response to the Mediterranean crisis has been to encourage, number one, to encourage our European allies to deal with this in a humanitarian and a fair manner. And we've reached out and helped them in a number of ways, including in registration and some pinpointed assistance in the Balkans areas and Greece. But let me add a but here. The EU is a powerful and rich organization, so it's not our intention to give a lot of assistance to Europe to deal with the problem. It's our feeling that they have the resources to do that. What we have concentrated on is looking for little niche areas of which we could be of assistance. And the two examples I can think of is one on registration assistance, and two, we're working with Shelley and UNHCR on some winterization programs in the Balkans. But what we've wanted to do with the world's attention on the Mediterranean crisis is to sort of use it to turn people's attention back to Syria and the region around it. That's where 96% or higher of the refugees remain. That's where the major needs continue. We have been involved, the world has been involved, the humanitarian system has been involved since the beginning of the crisis. Much of the world may have only taken attention since as Shelley said, refugees started showing up in the West. But we, UNHCR and others, have been working for years. And the U.S. has already invested $4.5 billion in humanitarian aid since the beginning of the crisis. So our question today for us is, what more can we do? How can we help more? Where are we going wrong? Where are we missing? What are we missing? I think we're doing a lot of good in the Middle East. We're keeping a lot of people alive. You don't read about starvation. You don't read about mass deaths that one might have read years ago in earlier crisis. So it's a sign that we're doing a lot of things right, but obviously with the war continuing so far, there's a lot more that needs to be done. So our concentration these days are looking at what more we can be done without giving up the very important factors of protection keeping borders open as much as we can, and making sure that people are fed and clothed. But beyond that, the two areas I'd like to mention today that we're focusing on are education and relief to resilience, relief to development. So two different ways of putting that. I think on education, we've made some good steps. There are almost 200,000 Syrian refugee children in school in Lebanon, 140,000 or so in Jordan, a number escaping me in Turkey. I can tell you how many are not in school in Turkey, 400,000. But the question is, how do we take what's working and expand that and deal with the 400,000 that aren't going to school in Turkey? And I think that's in two ways. The first way, we work to put more of our resources into education. And the second way is that we work with the three governments in the region to do more to change their policies, which will encourage more children to go to school in each of their countries. This is not to say that these three countries haven't already done incredible things and are a great host to the refugees, but we believe that there are some ways that a mixture of our assistance and their changing some of their policies could increase the chance of children going to school. One of these is the right to work. Now, obviously, the right to work has a lot more benefits than education. The right to work decreases the social burden on the state if people have jobs, restores pride and dignity to families, and it increases their economic well-being. But it also, at the same time, allows families to send their children to school. Many families are not sending their children to school because they just can't afford to do it, or their children are working. The other thing is relief to resilience. And I think this has a broader aspect than just the Middle East. And that issue is looking at ways to support the humanitarian system in a greater way with development work, development assistance, which goes not just to the refugee communities, but also to the host communities. The humanitarian system really wasn't set up to support populations for the years and years that it does. That's not just true in the Middle East, that's also true in Africa. I mean, there are cases where we have grandchildren of the original refugees being born in camps such as Dadaab. So we need to, on a world scale, look at ways to better deal with refugee populations over long terms with more than just humanitarian assistance, which is designed just to protect and keep people alive for the short term, or at least originally was designed to do that. There are a series of conferences over the next year, including the World Humanitarian Summit in May, which I think you'll see a lot of focus from us on these issues as we move through the year and trying to change the world's focus a little bit. Another issue as we move through this is funding. We're very proud of the amount of money that we've invested in the humanitarian system, but it's clearly not enough, and it's clearly not enough on a global scale either. So we need to look for more donations. Some Middle East countries have become good donors, but not always on a regular basis. So we have to find a way to integrate them into the humanitarian system. And we need to look for ways for other countries such as China or Brazil or South Africa or Indonesia to become part of the system and to become better contributors to it. We also need to look at private industry and private donors and look for ways that they can become more involved in the system. Finally, not quite at 16 minutes yet. I'll just say 1 minute worth of resettlement. Obviously, it's been in the news a lot lately. Resettlement is a very important policy of ours. We'll continue to support it. It's not a solution to refugee crises. Traditionally, only 1% of people are resettled, but it's an important element in taking the most vulnerable of those to new countries. We're being hit, I think, as an administration from both sides, those that believe we're not taking anywhere near enough, and those that believe that we shouldn't be taking in one Syrian refugee. We have a very secure, safe system It's a little slower than others, but it's our intention to continue bringing in Syrians, to increase the number of Syrians we're bringing in, and over the next few years to become the largest resettler of Syrian refugees, just as we are the largest resettler of any group of refugees that come through the UNHCR refugee resettlement system. Thanks.
Can I suggest 2 or 3 quick questions for Simon before he needs to leave, specifically on U.S. policy toward the crisis? Thank you.
I have a question. I'm afraid it's not on a Mediterranean refugee. It's in fact Lithuanian. Why does it take so long to get the green card for some of the people who are here already? For those of you who don't know, my husband, who was briefly executive director of the Institute of Current World Affairs, was killed in 2004, and I have a small foundation to help refugees from Eastern Europe. I have a case of somebody brought in by his mother at the age of 7, 13 years ago. She has now got her green card. She is married to an American citizen, although it took her 4 years. Her son, in his 3rd year at university, cannot work because he does not have a reasonable status. He has a 4.0 average and is an intern for Microsoft next summer, so he's neither black nor Muslim. But his papers went in at the beginning of this year. They asked for extra papers in May, and he has heard nothing, although his mother has a green card.
Okay, let's take all the questions and then go back to Simon. Please, Sir Pat.
Simon, if I had a chance to make my presentation, I would say I gave great kudos to DRM, especially for keeping the system going. My question is 18 to 24 months process. I understand there are improvements being made in the system. What are they? And can they speed it up, actually speed it up?
And maybe one final question for right there. Yeah, Jonathan has a question.
Hi, my name is Jonathan. I attend Teachers College. Attendance in schools is really important, but I'm wondering what percentage of students actually matriculate and finish their education and what curricular modules are being centered in the sites.
Could you repeat the last sentence?
What sorts of pedagogical or curricular modules are being centered in these sites? Are we trying to get people jobs? Are we trying to get them from early? What are we doing in our education?
In countries of first asylum. So I'll go backwards here. Start there. It focuses on primary education, getting children off the street into classes. More and more focus on secondary education, trying to build that up. Then on university and training, I think that's the last area that we've worked on, and there's a big focus on that this year. We're looking for a mixture of finding ways to make sure that kids that are going through not in some of the informal schools that started up have certificates that are valid, and working with the governments to make that so. So that's number one. Looking for new opportunities for vocational training, especially for kids that have been out of school for a while, and it's going to be hard for them to catch up. And then we're looking for university opportunities. On jobs and training, this is a really difficult political issue in all the countries there, because obviously they have political pushback. But we're working very hard diplomatically to convince them that there should be some areas, if not as many areas as possible, in which they allow refugees to work. There's been some progress in Turkey. A law has been passed, but due to the election climate, with 2 elections this year, there's no implementing regulations yet. We're encouraging them to do that. And Jordan is looking at allowing Syrians to work in some of the areas that other migrant workers are allowed to. 18 to 24 months. 18 to 24. Yeah, of course. Sorry. That's a great question. What we're not doing is changing the security parameters, that they stay the same. So what we're doing is we're trying to limit the period of time between when someone comes from, is recommended by UNHCR and we start processing. That has grown over the past few years, and we're working to have a more efficient system to keep that shorter. That will take out a number of months. And then we're working with DHS to better schedule DHS interviews so that people don't wait between when they're cleared for a DHS interview and have a DHS interview. That will have different effects in different areas, because in areas where we have a smaller number of refugee cases, we have to wait a while until the numbers build up. But in areas where we expect to have quite large numbers, we're working to have almost a continuous DHS presence. That will greatly speed things up. Then we're working at the other end, at the end where we turn refugees over to organizations in the States to shorten that period. And that probably would just save us a few weeks, but it's an important week. I think we will still, due to our need to have a rigorous security check, to be on the longer end compared with other countries. But I would point out that while that sometimes makes us not look so great when we're starting with a new population, over time we do bring in large numbers of people. We've brought in 140,000 Iraqis in the last 8 years, 140,000 Burmese in the last 10 years. We do, once we get our system up and running, have a very efficient system that moves large numbers of people through it quickly. Green card, I'm very sorry, not my area of expertise. With refugees, they're eligible to apply for a green card 1 year after arrival. It did sound to me like you might have been talking about an asylum case, which is not something I do. So I hate to do this, but I just have to say that that's a DHS issue, and I'm not an expert on getting green cards.
Thank you to Simon, who needs to leave. Thank you. We have altogether 7 minutes. So I apologize. We only have 7 minutes left.
Is it comment that there is there?
We have two interlocutors who want to speak briefly. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Would they mind coming up here, maybe? And yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm actually very nervous here to speak. I'm Syrian and this topic is very sensitive for me. I just want to tell you a few things, and first of all thank the panel because the discussion was very, actually the comments you guys made are very touching for me, and I'm going to try not to cry here, but it's been very painful. My first comment is about the international policy community. I feel that we are very, very far behind on responding to the voices of the people. In Syria, we have a dictatorship regime that has been ruling the country for more than 40 years. The father, Bashar al-Assad, and his son, the father, Hafez al-Assad, and his son, Bashar. I'm here today in Washington, D.C. I've been here living for 10 years because of direct death threats from Bashar al-Assad to my family in 2005. So what's going on in Syria has been, going on for so long. And the terrorism of the regime is not something new. And the terrorists on the ground, whether ISIS or Nusra Front or other groups, this is it's because of the Assad regime. It's because of his intentions from the beginning of the peaceful revolution in Syria to make it a civil war, to prove to the international community that he is the savior of the country, that there is no revolution, that the bloodshed and the people dying, that does not matter. He's killing terrorists. We are not terrorists. I'm not a terrorist. I'm Syrian. I'm very proud to be Syrian. I haven't been in my country for 10 years. I'm from Damascus, and I'm going to become a U.S. citizen next week, by the way. My test is on Thursday, and I hope I pass it. I have to go to Baltimore for it. I love this country so much. This country gave me so much opportunity to shine, to do so much work, and I've worked with Andrew in the past year at the Washington Institute. I've written pieces about Syria. I've been always advocating for Syrian rights and for our freedom as human beings inside of Syria. We're not terrorists. We just need the space for opportunity, for education, to thrive. We are really a hard-working nation. I had a full tuition scholarship from the University of Maryland based on my academic excellence in 2009. I did not pay anything for my undergrad. And right now I'm working on humanitarian projects in Syria and trying to help my country. I know this country can do so much, and I really want this country that's going to be my second home to help my first home, Syria, because I know we can do so much, and this country is based on religious freedoms. Those pilgrims that came here, they came for religious freedoms. We all know the history of this nation. We all know how everybody should be welcome, and everyone has the right to, for a safe haven and for a better life. So please help us, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much to the panel and also for all of you for being here. My name is Araida Hassani. I'm currently a master's student at Georgetown University focusing on international development. I'm a Dutch citizen with Iranian heritage, but as I'm not a refugee, I don't really want to focus on my personal story right now, but just some thoughts I have. Some of the comments will have been echoed in previous panels, but hopefully I have some additional ones as well. As we've mentioned before, the nature of refugees has been changing. We know that they've been staying longer, but I want to point out that it's not just because crises are more protracted, but that they're also more internal. So much of it has to do with the increasing shift from interstate conflict to intrastate conflict. So most conflicts are internal, like Rwanda and Yugoslavia and Syria, and we're seeing much more of that now. So in the past, when occupying forces left, refugees could return home, but that's no longer the situation we're dealing with. And then if we look at the Middle East and North Africa today, there are very few places of stability. Looking at Iraq and Syria, we are facing a reality now that in those countries especially, there's essentially no functioning state. And that larger issue really must be addressed. And again, the refugee situation is a symptom of that much larger issue. And if we are not addressing those root causes, we will essentially continue to see these large numbers. Lastly, to reflect on some things that were talked about in the first panel, the structures that we have in place were appropriate for the world that we lived in post-World War II, but now we have to ask whether those structures and the infrastructure we have, both in terms of domestic and international law, but also other physical infrastructure, whether that's appropriate for what refugees look like today, especially in regards to internally displaced people who essentially have very little legal framework within they receive protection, essentially because they didn't cross the border. So then we have to consider also how do we integrate them quickly, recognizing the fact that they're most likely also very traumatized, and I think we don't spend enough time talking about that. We have seen the tensions that it can create if we are not able to integrate refugees or immigrants or others well into our society. And lastly, if we don't engage with the crises earlier, as was mentioned, can we really be surprised when hundreds of thousands show up on our doorstep? We've essentially bought ourselves a much bigger problem. And one last thought that I'll leave you with is how we frame the problem or the issue will generally tend to lead us to specific solutions. So in our discussions and in our research and so on, if we say that the problem is we don't want refugees, you can begin to see how solutions such as building a wall and sending them home are the solutions that we come up with. But if we frame the question or the issue or the problem as refugees need protection, we see how different solutions and better solutions can be come up with.
Sure. We'll have maybe 2 or 3 questions or so, if possible.
After this,
All right. I'll try to be quick. I was less touched by what the
what the panel said and really more angry. I do believe that that much of this, if we look at it, we have about 5 million displaced people in Iraq after the invasion. Many of these people had to go to Syria and had to go to Amman, about 2 million in Amman, about 1 million in Syria, thus disrupting the social fabric of those particular regions and starting the tipping point toward the unrest we see today. There's about 8 or 9 wars taking place right now in Syria. We keep feeding the beast with more arms. There are arms merchants that are making a killing out of this, literally. Earlier, the gentleman said that we spent about $4 billion in humanitarian aid. We've spent hundreds of billions of dollars in military attacks and military bombings of civilian areas and have caused a huge amount of disruption to the region and to the people. I am no fan of Assad. I'm no fan of Saddam Hussein. I think they're horrible dictators, but we have to remember that we were culpable in setting them up. We were culpable in prompting them and making them the monsters that they became, only to make it convenient for us to go then and invade the region in order to make this change. We continue to see the arms merchants are the ones that are really benefiting from all of this, and the displacements will continue. I didn't see any real solutions. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we need to be able to take responsibility as the country that started that domino to fall, and we have to take responsibility. The idea that we are willing to accept 1% of the people that have been displaced in Syria is a crime. That is wrong. We have to accept hundreds of thousands of them in order for us to be able to at least justify what's happening right now in that region. So I am not as excited about the comments that have been made, honestly, because I do believe that we need some serious solutions and not just talk about the crisis, which is horrific by all measures, as we heard from many panelists. Thank you.
Okay, time for a few questions. Haley will walk around with the microphone.
Hi, my name is Julie Barlow, and I'm Canadian, and I write around France. And I'm wondering, as everyone has heard, Canada has promised to take in 25,000 refugees. But in an earlier presentation, I believe the figures I saw was about the same for the number of migrants who are arriving in Greece per week, or per month, I can't remember. It seems like a very small number, and now I've heard 1% are eventually resettled. And that's the global amount that are resettled. Why is that number so small? And how many should Canada be receiving? And of course, the U.S.
Anybody who wants to tackle this?
Well, the number is what it is. We always appeal for refugees to be resettled and to states to open their doors and establish policies that would allow for more resettlement. The High Commissioner went out for 400,000 for just 10% of the total number of Syrian refugees as an overall target. We're not close, but we're on track in years to come, hopefully, to get that number of people resettled. But clearly, that still leaves significant challenges for the 90% who are remaining and the new refugees that are being created every day as the war continues. Globally, every year we've been traditionally resettling in recent years, since after the Indo-Chinese crisis, we've been resettling about 100,000 people a year, and 70% have been coming to the United States. Those numbers are growing now, thankfully, but they've been pretty steady over recent years, especially after 9/11.
If I could just add a couple of really quick observations there too. Well, first of all, congratulations to Canada. It's been inspiring to see the headlines yesterday saying welcome to Canada, and seeing the way that families were received at the airport. I hope that it really rubs off on the neighbors to the south, especially after some of the things that have been said and done in the United States over the last month. my soapboxing on that aside, resettlement as a tool is an incredibly critical tool, but it always is really reserved for such a tiny fraction of people, especially when we're talking about a displacement crisis of this magnitude. I would put IRC in the category of the groups that Simon mentioned that have been a little tough on the administration, trying to push them and continue to, despite all this negative political rhetoric, to do more. We actually have called for the U.S. to resettle 100,000 Syrians and think the U.S. is capable of doing it with the pipeline and opening up some new categories of family reunification going forward. But even if it were the 100,000, it still will never be enough in the face of this conflict. But it has to happen for two reasons. One, because these are usually the most vulnerable people, female-headed households, people that have a handicapped child, et cetera, that got resettled. So it really does have an impact on individual lives. But probably, maybe even more importantly, I think it really is fundamental to our credibility. I mentioned before the figures in the region, Turkey hosting 2.2 million, Lebanon hosting 1.1 million. It is, from a diplomatic standpoint, very hard to pressure these countries to keep their doors open when we have ours shut.
Very quick, two more questions if possible. We have a couple more minutes left, and then we can move on. Joe, maybe? Very quick, Joe.
Thank you. Let's fast forward 5 to 7 years from now, let's say, and you said that historically speaking, only 1% are resettled. You would like to see 10% resettled. If we only look at the refugees and migrants coming from Syria and Iraq, which is over like 8 to 9 million people roughly. What would you see 5 to 6 years from now for the majority of these people? Would they be in refugee camps, like for example the Palestinian happening for a number of years? Give me a scenario of what those 8 million people would be doing 5 to 7 years from now. Where would they be?
Andrew?
So good question, Joe. I think many of you who have followed the Syrian war note that the areas that have been besieged by the regime, but not only, look a bit like Dresden after the Second World War. And so many people who are displaced can't return because nothing exists in that area. There's another reason why they can't return, and that is as a result of ethnic cleansing, they have, particularly Sunni populations have been moved out, but not only, of their areas and replaced with other sects or ethnicities who have come in to live in those areas. So they can't go home because of that reason. So what has happened is that the UN, I think to their credit, has noted this. And so one example of how they've tried to deal with it, because I don't think anybody can really answer that question ultimately, is they have provided them with temporary housing that is collapsible. Meaning that we could see, as maybe different parts of the Syrian war and or our ceasefires and so on, we could see people returning inside of Syrian territory into safe havens, into these buffer zones, but in temporary accommodation. The question is that a refugee camp? In the case of Jordan, you have formal refugee camps. I think those will probably remain for some time, probably upwards of 5 years. In Lebanon, we don't really have formal refugee camps per se because of the political history of those, and it's in countries like Lebanon where this becomes quite volatile, and a place where there could be other associated problems that come with this.
I truly apologize, but I've been told that we're at the very end of our time. Feel free to come up to the panelists if you have additional questions, and I want to thank all of you for participating.